We're going to look at early China now, its origins, and some of the early dynasties. Here are the terms. As always, make sure you write them down and then listen for them as we move forward. In very ancient times, a Chinese legend tells about floodwaters that rose and rose and rose to the top of the highest hills. There was a man named Yu, a hard-working official, and he worked for 13 years to drain the waters. He supposedly said, "I opened passages for the streams throughout the 9 provinces and conducted them to the sea. I deepened channels and canals and conducted them to the streams." Well, while taming the rivers, Yu did not once go home to see his wife and children. As a reward for his selfless efforts, he later became ruler of China. So this is a story that the Chinese tell, a legend, about a man who may or may not have existed, but this legend of Yu offers insights into early China and early Chinese thought. The ancient Chinese valued the ability to control floodwaters and to develop irrigation systems for farming. The legend also shows how highly the Chinese prized devotion to duty, and this is going to be a big idea in Chinese history and society. Both of these values played a key role in the development of Chinese civilization. All of the ancient civilizations we've looked at so far have had at least one thing in common: the importance of geography in helping to form civilizations, and specifically the importance of rivers. In China, the key rivers are the Huanghe River, or the Yellow River, and the Yangtze River. And if you look at this map, you can see them. It's those blue lines. You can see the Yellow River to the north, and then the Yangtze River south of that. The Huanghe, or Yellow River, stretches east to west for almost 3,000 miles. And it's called the Yellow River because of this rich silt that it carries that gives it a yellow color. And as you can see here, it also empties into the Yellow Sea. Ancient Chinese civilization began along the banks of this river. And, think of the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Nile in Egypt. People settle along rivers because the river provides what they need for farming and so forth. It provides fertile soil, which gives them food. And this used to be known as the River of Sorrow because of its flooding, which could be quite violent. So here you see the Yangtze River, and it's even longer than the Yellow River. It flows almost 3,964 miles, and it flows across central China. And it's interesting and really significant that both of these rivers flow east to west because that facilitates transportation and communication in those directions, but not to the north. In this case, with the Yangtze also, it passes through some of China's best, most fertile farmland, as well as many of the towns and villages that emerged along its banks. So here you see a map showing China and its geographical features. And if you look at this, you'll notice several things. You notice the boundaries of this country. Some of the boundaries are mountains. They have a lot of natural boundaries. So you have mountain ranges, you have deserts, you have plateaus. And what all of these do together is they come together to isolate the Chinese. In the north, we have deserts, several of them, but primarily the Gobi Desert. And the Gobi Desert, it's very large and one of the driest in the world. And people used to say, "Enter and you shall never return," because of its just huge size and the heat and the dryness. And it was one of those situations where, if you found yourself stranded out there, there's nowhere you can go for help. And then we have plains. and about 12% of China's land is plains. And a lot of that is in the eastern part of China. About 43% of China's land is mountainous, and this is huge if you think about it. This is going on close to half of all of Chinese land being mountains, which provide borders, boundaries. And then you have the Tibetan Plateau, which is very large, and it's a very isolated region, even today. So what's the main idea here? Well, the main idea is that these geographical features isolate China. And because of that, we see the unchanging nature of Chinese society, very similar to Egypt's early in Egyptian history. And here with the Chinese, even into the 20th century, we see the same institutions, the same government system. Their land contributes to the way the society turns out. The Gobi Desert, which I mentioned, for example, you can't farm there. You can't permanently support a population. But what we do see happening is pastoral population settling along the fringes of the desert. And so society, based on this geography early on, was very, very difficult. So how would isolation help a country, do you think? And what other great civilizations were isolated? Well, I mentioned the Egyptians. There were others as well. So what's the impact? Well, the long distances and physical barriers like the mountains and the deserts isolated China, blocking cultural diffusion. So what that means is that for a long period in their history, the Chinese are not coming into contact with other peoples, other cultures. As a result of that, they're not coming into contact with other ideas. And so they're going to be a largely self-contained society. The geography did protect China from invasion for a long, long period in her history. Taught them to rely on themselves. And it contributed to the Chinese belief that China was the center of the earth and the only civilization. So where does Chinese civilization and Chinese history begin? Well, civilization first emerged in China's river valleys around 4,000 years ago with the founding of the Xiou dynasty. And this is considered to be the traditional founding of Chinese civilization. And it's thought to have stretched from about 2200 BC to 1766 BC. We don't know a lot about this dynasty, but legend says that its first ruler was named Yu, and he's the guy I mentioned earlier. He's the one who drained the floodwaters that threatened parts of China. And that's something that is very necessary in this civilization. It's necessary to be able to manage water. Water control works were always fundamental to Chinese civilization. So according to tradition, he tamed the Huanghe River. According to tradition, he was also a descendant of the gods. And the story goes that he achieved greatness around 2205 BC and was very well liked by the people. According to a traditional Chinese saying, quote, "We should have been fish, but for you," and that's referring to his ability to control the river. So supposedly, this guy controlled the river, became a hero to the people, and then was selected as the ruler. And he then went on to make rulers hereditary. So he begins the first dynasty in China. What's really interesting here is that Yu was selected to be the ruler of China based on his achievement. And it's really interesting because He wasn't necessarily from an upper class family, and his own father had tried to control the flood but not been successful, and so was executed. And yet here's you, the first ruler of China. And this shows us that this society at that time selected people by achievement. Now, it's not always going to be like that, but here at the beginning, we see that idea at play. Well, what else do we know about them? We know that they farmed, they were agrarian, so we don't see a lot of industry early on. We know that the ruling families used elaborate and dramatic rituals to confirm their power to govern, to establish to the people that they were the rightful rulers. And the rulers often acted as shamans, communicating with spirits for help and guidance. So they were like the go-betweens between the people and the gods, the spirits. And this is very similar to the kings in Mesopotamia, who were the link between man and the gods. Xiao Zhe was the last emperor of the Xiao dynasty. We know that he was a hedonist, a tyrant. He abused his people. He put himself first, really, and as a result of his actions, the people and the dynasty during his reign were just driven into disaster. It was very chaotic. And as an example, we know that he wanted to be entertained, and so he ordered that 3,000 of his subjects jump into a lake of wine, and then he sat and enjoyed watching them drown. Well, it's because of actions like this and just very bad decisions he made regarding his people and the country he was ruling. It's a result of this that we see a lot of chaos at the end of his reign especially. And we're going to see him beginning to lose power. And one of the things that's going on is that around 1650 BC, another group of Chinese people called the Shang are going to gain control of northern China along the Huanghe. And we're going to see the Xiao losing their grip on the territory that they're controlling because they have poor leadership. They're not going to be able to put up a strong front and fight back, and they're going to end up losing control and coming to an end. So what ends up happening? Well, as I said, around 1650 BC, the Shang began controlling northern China along the Huanghe River, and they begin slowly but surely eating away at the Xiao territory until they take over. And they are going to establish their own dynasty, and they're going to dominate this region until 1027 BC. This is a very important dynasty because it's during the Shang period that Chinese civilization really took shape. And even there's going to be some changes along the way, the ideas and achievements of this early civilization have survived down to the present day. We know that it was a farming-based civilization, so again, we're not seeing a lot of industry. So what are they growing? Things like millet, wheat, rice. They're domesticating animals, oxen, sheep, horses, goats, dogs, chickens, pigs, much like other peoples in the Fertile Crescent in Egypt. We know that society was ruled by an aristocratic class that was consumed by warfare. You have a king, the Shang king, and he ruled with the help of a bureaucracy. And this would have been the people who got things done for him. And we know that the kingdom was divided into territories governed by aristocrats. The king was referred to as the Son of Heaven, and all affairs of state were in his hands. He decided policy, he fixed tribute, he commanded the army. The Shang capital was at a city called Anyang. That's Anyang. And there is archaeological evidence of some pretty impressive cities with huge city walls, huge royal palaces, and tombs. And here you see a reproduction of what one of the royal palaces would have looked like. And their architecture for that period of time was pretty impressive. And here you see the foundations of the actual royal palace. This would have been the foundations of that reproduction that I showed you a moment ago. And they are still uncovering some amazing finds from this period of time. Archaeology has also showed that there were some royal tombs that were furnished on a grand scale. One that was excavated had 2 levels, a burial pit containing the deceased ruler, surrounded by remains of human and animal sacrifices, 79 humans and 52 animals. And so this tells us that human sacrifice was practiced during the Shang dynasty, though I will say that it will decline after the Shang dynasty ends. Archaeologists have uncovered other large palaces and rich tombs of Shang rulers, and we've learned that Shang kings led other noble warriors in battle, and from their walled capital city, they emerged to drive off nomads from the northern steppes and deserts. In one Shang tomb, archaeologists discovered the burial place of a ruler named Wu Ding, he was the king, and his wife, Fu Hao. And you see them here. And artifacts show that she owned land and helped to lead a large army herself, around 13,000 soldiers, and she actually led them into battle against invaders. So this evidence suggests that noble women had a considerable status during the Shang period. Here you see Fu Hao's tomb. It was discovered in 1976, and archaeologists spent years excavating it, and it's just given us a wealth of information about this period of time and this dynasty and the status of women, as I said. And as I said a moment ago, women held considerable status, at least noble women, and this is very unusual for the ancient world because women generally didn't have much of a status. Women basically were to be seen and not heard. We've learned a lot from Fu Hao's tomb, and one reason it's so important is because it's the only royal tomb of the Shang dynasty that has not been looted. So much like King Tut's tomb in Egypt, it was found intact, and it's just given us a wealth of information about the Shang dynasty. It's been dated to around 1250 BC, and it's not a huge tomb. It's pretty modest size, but we know that there were several levels, and the floor level held the royal corpse and most of the utensils and various things that were buried with her. Below the corpse was a small pit, and this held the remains of 6 dogs. And then along the perimeters lay the skeletons of 16 humans, which implies that either servants were brought with her or sacrifices were made for her. Inside the pit was a wooden chamber, and in this was a lacquered coffin, which unfortunately wasn't in great shape. Much of it is rotted away. And there also seems to have at one time been some sort of structure built over the tomb that was used for holding memorial ceremonies. We know about Fu Hao from various sources, but one of them is something that I'll be talking about in a moment, something called oracle bones. She's mentioned in oracle bones inscriptions as the consort of King Wu Ding, and a general. She was a general who participated in several military campaigns. And we learn that she also presided over important sacrificial ceremonies and actually controlled her own estate. So this is a woman that really had some power. And just to give you an idea of some of what was in her tomb, there were 468 bronze objects, including more than 130 weapons and other things, 755 jade objects, 63 stone objects, pottery, and on and on and on. So this just tells us a lot about not just this period of time, but also the importance of women, at least some women, in this dynasty. What was society like during the Shang dynasty? We know there were large cities, but who would have lived in them? Well, not everybody. Only the royal family would have lived there, as well as the nobility and their retainers, and those are the people who worked for them. Everyone else would have lived outside. So those people I just mentioned lived inside the walls where they were somewhat protected. Everybody else lives outside the walls. Who is everybody else? Peasants. While there is a small percentage of nobles at the top of society, the great majority of the population were peasants, and they clustered together in farming villages. Many lived in thatch-roofed pit houses whose earthen floors were dug several feet below the surrounding ground, and these homes actually preserved the heat in the winter and remained cool in the summer. By Shang times, the Chinese had developed some pretty complex religious beliefs. We know that they prayed to many gods and nature spirits, and chief among them were a mother goddess who brought plants and animals to earth, and then a god known as Shangdi. Shangdi was chief among all of the gods. He was sometimes associated with the sky or with heaven, and it was believed that he was a god who controlled victory in battle, he controlled the harvest, he controlled the fate of the capital and the weather. So he had a lot of power. And during the Shang dynasty, he was considered to be the supreme deity, the supreme god. The king was seen as the link between the people and Shangdi. And again, contrast that or compare that with Mesopotamia, where the king serves the same function. He's that link between the two worlds. Now, the Chinese believed that gods as great as Shangdi would not respond to the pleas of mere mortals. Only the spirits of the greatest mortals, such as the ancestors of the king, they believed, could get the attention of Shangdi, or as they sometimes referred to him, the Lord of Heaven. So, the prayers of rulers and nobles to their ancestors were thought to be essential to the community as a whole, ensuring good harvest or victory in war. The idea being that you're praying to your ancestors, but then those prayers will go to Shangdi. The ruler's power, in fact, grew out of this veneration of ancestors. At first, only the royal family and other nobles had important enough ancestors to influence the gods, but gradually other classes shared in the rituals that emerged, and the Chinese called on the spirits of their ancestors to bring good fortune to the family. To honor their ancestor spirits, they offered them sacrifices of food and other necessities. And when Westerners reached China many, many centuries later, they mistakenly called this practice ancestor worship. But the reality is they were not worshiping their ancestors, but rather the ancestors were like intermediaries between this world and the world of the gods, especially Shangdi. The Chinese believed that the universe reflected a delicate balance between two forces called the yin and the yang. Yin was linked to earth, darkness, and female forces, while yang stood for heaven, light, and male forces. To the Chinese, these forces were not in opposition. Instead, the well-being of the universe depended on harmony between yin and yang. and people played a role in maintaining this harmony. For example, the king had to make the proper sacrifices to heaven while at the same time taking practical steps to rule as well as he could. So the idea here is there needs to be harmony in everything you do. Like other early societies, the ancient Chinese also developed a system of writing, and it used both pictographs and signs that express thoughts or ideas. The oldest examples of Chinese writing are on oracle bones, and you see one here in this picture. And these were used by priests to predict the future. So they would take animal bones or turtle shells, and the Shang priests would write questions addressed to the gods or the spirit of an ancestor. And these questions generally required a yes or no answer. The priest would then heat the bone or the shell until it cracked, and then they would interpret the pattern of cracks, and that interpretation would give them the answers they needed or advice from their ancestors. Written Chinese took shape almost 4,000 years ago. And over time, it evolved to include tens of thousands of characters. Each character represented a word or idea and was made up of a number of different strokes. In recent times, the Chinese have simplified their characters, but Chinese, even today, remains one of the most difficult languages to learn. Students, even today, have to memorize up to 10,000 characters to read just a newspaper. By contrast, languages based on an alphabet, like English or Arabic, only contain about 24 or so symbols representing basic sounds. Because it was so difficult, only the well-to-do could afford the years of study needed to master the skills of reading and writing. And working with brush and ink, Chinese scholars would turn calligraphy or fine handwriting into an elegant art form. But even though it was a very complex writing system, this written language still fostered unity. The people in different parts of China were isolated by their geographical barriers. They could not understand each other's spoken language, but they all used the same system of writing, and so that brought them together. The Shang dynasty is important for several reasons. It's actually the first recorded Chinese dynasty where we have both documentary and archaeological evidence. Like the Xiou dynasty that I mentioned before, we have archaeological remains but no written word. But here we have written records. We know that during this period, it's the Bronze Age still, but we know that many people were or became accomplished artisans and artists, and they were the most advanced bronze workers of the ancient world. And here in this picture, you see a bronze wine vessel. So what ends up happening to them? Well, there's another group that's going to take power by force and overthrow the Shang dynasty. Why? Well, towards the end, the Shang dynasty has become corrupt. The last Shang king, a man named Shao Xin, is said to have been a physical giant and just this monster of depravity who, among other things, made drinking cups out of the skulls of his enemies that he had defeated. We know that their leaders lived extravagantly, spending huge amounts of money on royal buildings and display. China was in a state of near constant warfare, and that really just uses up all your resources. And because of this, because we see this weakening, we also see another young, powerful dynasty that lived on the fringes of Shang China, a group known as the Zhou, rise up against the Shang. And they're going to end up overpowering the Shang, overthrowing the Shang, and taking over. And they will start a new dynasty. The Zhou were actually considered to be barbarians and pretty uncivilized by the Shang, but they seem to have quickly adopted Shang life and government, so that there really was little difference between the two dynasties. By about 1027 BC, the Zhou succeeded in defeating the last Shang king and sacking the capital city of Anyang, where the Shang king died in flames of his own palace. And from their defeat of the Shang, the Zhou dynasty claimed the right to rule all China. The Zhou dynasty is going to be China's longest dynasty, ruling about 900 years almost, down to 256 BC. Zhou China is going to be much larger than Shang China. Shang China had controlled a kind of a small region in the Yellow River area. And if you look at this map, you can see the territory controlled by the Shang, which is like the dark orange. And then if you look at the yellow territory around it, that's the Zhou dynasty. So they come in, they conquer the Shang, they incorporate that territory into their existing territory, and then they'll continue to conquer. But now they have a problem. There are these outsiders who have come in, and their problem is, how do we legitimize our power? We're outsiders. Because what happens if your only claim to political power is that your army was stronger than that of the last emperor? Well, the idea there is someone with an even stronger army can come in and have the right to take power away from you. We'll see this in the Roman Empire. Rome in a 50-year period has 22 emperors. So even though the Zhou essentially continued the political system they'd overthrown, for example, they kept the king assisted by a bureaucracy, they still had to contend with the validity of their rule. So how are they going to do that? Well, they develop and argue something they called the mandate of heaven, which argued that there's a moral basis for political power. The term mandate of heaven was an explanation for the success and failure of monarchs and states down to the end of the empire in 1912. And here's what I mean. The Zhou were literate as well as powerful, and so they gave their own account of the excesses and oppression of the Shang as justification for their conquest, and so were the first to use what would become the standard Chinese justification for political change. The idea is the old king and dynasty was corrupt. It was our duty to overthrow it. Here's what the Zhou said. The iniquity of Shang is full. Heaven commands me to destroy it. So what does that mean? Well, that the Shang had lost the mandate or approval of heaven by their misgovernment, and it was the duty of responsible people to overthrow them. Because of the wickedness of the last Shang king, the rebellion was later considered justified. So the idea that the Zhou came in and took over is justified because they're overthrowing this corrupt dynasty. Unlike as the Shang or the Zhou put it, the wicked Chao Xin, that's the last Shang emperor, the last Shang king, the new Zhou king was said to be virtuous and to follow the moral ways of heaven. So the Zhou claimed that they ruled China because it possessed the mandate of heaven, sometimes called the Tianming, even though they had simply taken power by force. They believed that heaven, which in the Chinese belief system was not a single god, but an impersonal force of nature, kept order in the universe through the Zhou king, who was the intermediary between heaven and earth. So the king had the mandate or authority to rule bestowed upon him by heaven. And the king was chosen to rule because of his talent and virtue. And he was responsible for ruling well and efficiently. And this idea, the mandate of heaven, became the bedrock of Chinese statecraft. And like I say here on the slide, it's just this deeply rooted Chinese belief that rulers who are virtuous and care for the people receive heaven's blessing. If they become corrupt, they forfeit that. And then it's okay, it's justified to get rid of them. There's two sides to the mandate of heaven. The king, on the one hand, was expected to rule properly, and this was an idea known as the Tao. He was supposed to keep the gods happy in order to protect the people from natural disaster. If the king failed to rule effectively, he could be overthrown and replaced by a new ruler. And this is a big deal. There are strong political consequences to this idea, and it really justifies the right to revolution. If you think about it, it justifies the overthrowing of a bad king. It makes clear that the Chinese king is not divine, even though he is a representative of heaven. The belief in the mandate of heaven is closely tied to something called dynastic cycles. From the beginning of Chinese history up until 1911, China was ruled by a series of dynasties. Some of them, like the Shang and the Zhou, lasted for hundreds of years, while others will last for much shorter periods. But regardless of how long each ruled China, each ruled with the mandate of heaven, and each followed a similar pattern. So a dynastic cycle is kind of like a clock with key stages at 12, 3, 6, and 9 o'clock. And no matter how long any particular dynasty lasted, each changed according to this pattern. So, you look at this chart that I put here, look at 12 o'clock, a new dynasty establishes its power. There's going to be things that it does to consolidate its power. It rules successfully for many years. And then you start to move forward, and like it says, everything's working better in the empire. Things are going great for a while. You get to 3, and the empire is at the peak of its power, but then successful rule begins to decline. Crises emerge. The power of the central government begins to collapse. You've got things like famine, natural disaster. You get down to 6. The decline becomes visible. And then you start moving up. You get to 9. The dynasty collapses, giving rise to rebellion and even invasion, until another dynasty comes along and takes over. And then you do it all over again. And here you see another representation of this dynastic cycle, and that's exactly what it is, a cycle. It just goes on and on and on, with each new dynasty coming in, claiming the mandate of heaven, and going through all of the same steps throughout the cycle. And the Zhou dynasty followed this pattern. It had centuries of wise and efficient rulers, and then the dynasty began to decline. In 403 BC, civil war broke out, and that began a period that Chinese historians refer to as the period of the warring states. This will eventually bring an end to the Zhou dynasty in 256 BC. And according to tradition, they lost the mandate of heaven. The Zhou dynasty was very important because it's with this dynasty that we see the full flowering of ancient civilization in China. During this period, the empire was unified. A middle class arose. This is the business class. It's no longer going to be just the nobles at the top and the peasants below. We see iron being introduced, so China moves from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. A scholar named Confucius will develop the code of ethics that dominates Chinese thought and culture for the next 25 centuries. Some of the achievements included astronomers studying the movement of planets and recording eclipses of the sun, and their findings helped them develop an accurate calendar with 365 and a fourth days. Sound familiar? By 1000 BC, the Chinese had discovered how to make silk thread from the cocoons of silkworms and the mulberry trees on which they fed. And silk is going to become very important to Chinese culture and their economy. It's going to become a major export, and it's going to become their most valuable export. Because it was such a time-consuming process, only royalty and nobility could afford it. But once China eventually opens itself up to the outside world, others are going to want this, especially like we'll see the Roman Empire. They actually traded with the Chinese during much of this period, and silk becomes a major item that they want. And then even beyond the Zhou dynasty, we see silk continuing to travel. Under the Zhou, the Chinese made the first books. They bound thin strips of wood or bamboo together and then carefully drew characters on the flat surface with a brush and ink. The earliest Chinese books included histories and religious works. One example was a book called the I Ching, a handbook for diviners, and it's still used by people who want to foretell the future. Among the greatest Zhou works is the Book of Songs, and it's a book of poems and songs, and many of them describe events in the lives of farming people, things like planting and harvesting. Others praise kings or describe court ceremonies. The book also includes tender or sad love songs. In one lyric, a young woman complains that her family is forcing her into a marriage she does not want. It says, "My heart is a mirror, to reflect what others will. Brothers too I have, I cannot be snatched away. But lo, when I told them of my plight, I found that they were angry with me." So a lot of the poems, the songs in this book just are really a reflection of what society was like at that time, what was important, who the various people were, the various classes, and what their part in society was. By 256 BC, China was a large, wealthy, and highly developed center of civilization. Chinese culture was already dominant in East Asia, but the Zhou dynasty was too weak to control powerful lords who fought each other in savage wars. If you remember, I mentioned that they're torn apart by civil war, the period of the warring states. And out of these wars, we're going to see a ruthless leader emerge, and he was determined to impose political unity on China. And his triumphs will leave a lasting imprint on Chinese civilization. And that is another story which we will visit in the next lecture.